Okay, looks like we're live. So let me get started with what we're talking about today. So this will be the last of our lectures and readings on for Module 3 for our module on freedom of expression. And today we're looking at a classic free speech case, Schneck versus United States. To give you a little bit of background, the socialist group that Schneck was a part of was mailing leaflets to men who had been drafted into the military during World War I. The leaflets urged them not to comply with the draft, using lots of different sort of arguments. And he and some others in his group were convicted of violating the Espionage Act, which prohibited, among other things, interferences with the draft and recruitment of military personnel in general. So he appealed, he and his counsel appealed to the Supreme Court, and his conviction was, in the Supreme Court, upheld unanimously. So all of the justices agreed that the lower courts had made the right decision in convicting him. All right, so let's then look at the court's opinion and consider some of their arguments and put them into the broader context of the debate. The court's opinion points out that a number of different arguments were made on behalf of the defendant, but the most important one for our purposes is the First Amendment argument, the argument that they should have been permitted to distribute these leaflets by the First Amendment's guarantee of freedom of speech and press. So the idea is that, much like in the previous case that we saw, the thought is that you can't be punished for speaking on these sort of issues, because the First Amendment should protect you against that. So remembering back to Snyder v. Phelps, although that case came much, much later, this case is being heard in the early part of the 20th century, and Snyder v. Phelps is a very recent case. But looking back at what we read in the opinions on that, clearly the issues being discussed in the leaflets were ones of public concern and interest. They're about the legality of the draft. They're about the question of whether the USA ought to have been involved in World War I. They're about questions of individual Americans' duties to uphold freedom and the rights given to them in the Constitution, and things that are very clearly on political, social questions of the day. So they're exactly the kind of topics that the First Amendment was most trying to protect freedom of expression about, according to the opinions in Snyder v. Phillips. So these sort of leaflets get the most protection of any kind of speech if we consider the arguments that were made by the majority opinion in particular in Snyder v. Phelps. Yet the court in this case sees this still as a case where it's right to regulate speech in the way that the Espionage Act did. And the court admits that in peacetime, in many places, even during wartime, apart from mailing directly to men who had recently been drafted, the leaflets would have been perfectly permissible. That any law which obstructed them would likely have been unconstitutional. However, the argument goes, in the court's opinion, during wartime and directly presented and mailed to men who had recently been drafted, in that context, under those circumstances, these leaflets cross the line into a place where the court feels that it's permissible to regulate speech, even with respect to the First Amendment. And Holmes, the writer of this opinion, says that there's no reasonable interpretation of the First Amendment which would prohibit regulation of speech under these circumstances, which is interesting. And he says this is where the famous example of yelling fire in a crowded theater comes from. This is an example that probably almost all of you have heard, if you've ever heard any debates about the limits on free speech or the limits on the First Amendment before. This example comes up all the time, that it's not absolutely unlimited free speech which is protected by the First Amendment, or which anyone should think that we ought to protect. There are certain circumstances under which speech can be rightly regulated, and yelling fire in a crowded theater, which causes a panic, causes people to trample each other, that sort of speech can be rightly regulated, as this argument goes. And the lesson that, and so this is the place where that example comes from, is this opinion, this Supreme Court opinion. The lesson that the court gets from this, that they say in their argument, is the foundational principle under which we find that yelling fire in a crowded theater is not permissible, is that when some sort of speech or expression would create a clear and present danger to bring about some sort of substantive evil, which we can rightly prevent as a society, under those circumstances, speech can be rightly regulated. Now, as a historical matter, this test was later abandoned by the court since it seemed to apply too broadly, but the basic spirit of it has remained. And this sort of argument, then, is the one which was used to uphold the conviction of Schneck. And the argument is that these leaflets, printed during wartime, distributed during wartime, directly to men who had been recently drafted, presents a clear and present danger, creates a clear and present danger, and can be rightly regulated. So it's like yelling fire in a crowded theater, is the argument here. Now, we might ask ourselves, is it true that sending leaflets of that kind do constitute a clear and present danger that we should rightly regulate? You can certainly see the arguments why they might, because of the importance of the draft in winning the war. To undermine the draft in this way would create a danger to the United States and society at large, right? If you can think about it in those terms. You can also see an argument why they aren't like yelling fire in a crowded theater. They're presenting a view on a political subject, and that's the kind of thing that we want to protect, even when it's the sort of thing that is encouraging people to engage in activities which might be socially detrimental. In fact, their opinion is that we ought not be in the war in the first place, right? So, from their point of view, there is no clear and present danger being presented. Rather, what they're doing is they're alerting people to a very real danger that exists. It's not like shouting fire in a crowded theater when there is no fire. It's more like shouting fire in a crowded theater when there is in fact a fire. And so you're saving people you're not harming them, right? The yelling fire in a crowded theater is only a problem when there isn't actually a fire, right? So there's lots of different views that you could easily have on how the court's reasoning applies to this particular case. And then you could also think about whether their reasoning is the appropriate thing to think. Should freedom of expression be limited by this test of clear and present danger? So it was a very short reading, so it comes to a fairly short lecture. I'll pause now to see if there are any questions that anyone has. Okay, looks like no questions for today. So tomorrow I will do some review for the for Module 3 before I post the exam. Feel free to post questions on the D2L discussion forums, and I'd be happy to answer them. Also, feel free to show up, and I'd be very pleased for any questions that are provided to me live. I also will go over a little bit the exam from the last module, from Module 2. People did much better on that exam, and I'm very pleased to see that. There were still some common mistakes, but those I can talk a little bit about tomorrow as well. Okay, thanks.